Tonight, let us drift on a slow westward tide to a world where the longships did not turn back, a world where the sagas speak not of a fleeting shore, but of a home growing roots deep into the rich, forested soil of a new continent. Close your eyes and breathe in the salt and pine. Listen to the creak of oak and the lap of a gentler Atlantic. Here, in this soft space between what was and what might have been, the Norse settlements in Vinland did not fade like a footprint in the sand. They remained, they grew, and the world, ever so slowly, began to turn to a different rhythm. Our point of divergence is not a thunderclap, but a sigh of relief. It is the year 1010. In the struggling settlement known to Leif Erikson's people as Leifsbúðir, the air is sharp with the coming autumn, a crispness that speaks of long nights ahead. A young man named Thorbjorn, son of a Greenlandic farmer, stands at the edge of the clearing, his axe heavy in his hand. He is tired of the thin soil of Greenland, tired of the whispers of failure that followed their group across the sea. He looks at the towering white pines, the grapevines heavy with fruit, the rivers silver with fish. He thinks of his father's voice, urging a return, but then he looks at the smoke curling from the hearth of a longhouse built with his own hands. He feels the solidity of the earth beneath his boots, and he makes a quiet decision, a decision echoed in the hearts of a few other families. He puts down his axe, not to pack, but to build a better fence. He chooses to trust the land. That winter, they share their preserved fish with a small band of the local Beothuk people, who show them how to tap the maple trees for a sweet, sustaining syrup. It is a fragile thread of trust, spun from necessity and quiet curiosity. It does not snap. This is the first soft stitch in a new tapestry. Yosta generations are like seasons in this new world, each one layering its own quiet change upon the last. Leifsbúðir becomes Vinlandby, a permanent port. The longhouses, once stark against the sky, begin to change. They keep their stout timber frames, but their roofs over decades are thatched with the local marsh grass that turns gold in the sun, and their walls are sometimes infilled with a daub made from the region's pale clay, giving them a softer, warmer look against the green. Paths of crushed shell and smooth river stone wind between them, leading down to the harbors where the classic Norse Nars, the broad-bellied cargo ships, rest beside new, shallower drafted boats learned from indigenous designs, perfect for the intricate coastlines. The world expands at the pace of a walking man or a sailing ship hugging a coastline. Trade routes are not lines on a map, but slow seasonal currents of exchange. From Vinlandby, settlers push south along the coast and west up the great riverways. They establish outposts they call Soltifjord in the sheltered bays to the south and Vitvin near the Great Lakes, named for the mist that rises from the waters at dawn. These are not forts, but trading posts, Kaupanga, where goods and stories mingle. And what travels these routes? Not just iron nails and woolen Vermont cloth from the east, though those are prized. From the deep forests come furs of incredible softness, beaver, fox, and marten, bundles of medicinal herbs and roots whose uses are carefully recorded in runic scripts alongside their local names. Most precious of all is knowledge. Norse shipwrights, masters of the open ocean, learn to read the river currents and the signs of weather and the behavior of birds from the Mi'kmaq and Penobscot guides, who become regular travelers at their settlements. In return, the Norse introduced the rotary quern for grinding grain and the careful selective breeding of sheep and goats. The metal they bring, iron for tools, not weapons, slowly spreads inland, not as a tool of conquest, but as a useful material, transforming agriculture and woodworking. The wheel, previously unknown in these parts, finds its first use not on carts, but as a pulley for hauling fishing nets and building timber. Now, let us step into this world through a single pair of eyes. In the long, gentle twilight of a summer's day in the late 13th century. Her name is Asta, and she is sitting on a wharf in Vinland, her bare feet skimming the cool, dark water of the harbor. The air smells of tar, drying fish, and the sweet, wild roses that climb a trellis by the mead hall. Asta is waiting for her father's ship, the Dram, meaning dream. It is a hybrid vessel, a Norse hull with a single square sail of woven wool, but also with the extra long steering oar and shallow draft of a coastal craft. In its hold are bundles of dyed porcupine quills from the west, a novelty for the embroiderers back in Iceland, and a small chest of glass beads from as far away as Venice, traded through a long, slow chain across the Atlantic. Asta's own tunic is a blend of worlds. It is woven from the wool of Vinland sheep, dyed a deep blue with woad, but the trim is embroidered with intricate swirling patterns that are not quite Norse knotwork, but something looser inspired by the beadwork she has seen on the pouches of her friend, a woman named Kese from the inland river peoples. In her lap is a wooden tablet, and she is practicing her runes, but the sentence she is carving is a simple trading phrase in a blend of Old Norse and the local tongue. Language here is a river with many tributaries. The Old Norse tongue is the bedrock, but it softens, picking up words for new animals, new plants, new concepts. The word for K-nu becomes K-nu. The word for the vast endless forest to the west is Mikilsko. It is a language of practicality and poetry, born of shared meals and quiet afternoons of barter. She hears a familiar shout and sees the drummer rounding the headland, its sail a patch of sunset orange against the lavender sky. Her heart lifts, light with frantic excitement, but with a deep, settled gladness. This is the rhythm of her life, the leaving and the return, the bringing of stories from over the horizon. Her father will speak of trading copper from the Great Lakes for honey from the south, and of a new story he heard about a vast, grassy sea to the west, where herds of shaggy creatures thunder. Asta will listen, and later she will add these details to the map she keeps in her mind. A map not of borders, but of connections. As centuries turn, the Atlantic becomes not a barrier, but a bridge, a slower, gentler bridge than in our own hurried history. Regular, if not frequent, contact is maintained with Iceland, Greenland, and eventually with the kingdoms of Scandinavia and the British Isles. To news travels slowly, carried on the spring and autumn winds. The Black Death that ravages Europe in the 14th century does reach the shores of Vinland, but its passage is slower, its impact softened by lower population density and medicinal knowledge shared from indigenous practices. The world of the North Atlantic becomes a distinct cultural sphere. In the great halls of Norway, kings receive ambassadors from the Vinlandic Commonwealth, who speak of alliances forged not by sword, but by kinship and trade agreement. These ambassadors wear cloaks fastened with polished copper brooches in shapes of turtles and loons, and their speech is a melodic, familiar, yet strange dialect that fascinates the court skalds. Technology evolves through synthesis, not domination. In the Vinlandic settlements, watermills dot the rivers, grinding grain and powering simple bellows for forges. But the forests are not cleared with reckless abandon. There are laws carved on standing stones at the edge of the woods about sustainable cutting, learned from hard winters, and the wisdom of those who knew the land first. Ship design reaches an elegant apex. Vessels that can brave the deep ocean but also navigate shallow estuaries, their prows sometimes carved with the faces of Norse gods, sometimes with the protective spirits of the local waters. Imagine the soundscape of this world. You know Vinland Beothuk here, the familiar clang of a blacksmith's hammer, but also the rhythmic scrape of a canoe being hollowed from a cedar log. You would hear Old Norse sagas recited by firelight, tales of Thor and Odin, but the stories might now include new heroes who journey to the underworld through caves in the mountains, or who befriend the thunderbirds that live behind the waterfalls. The music is from bone flutes and skin drums, from lyres and voices raised in harmonies that seem to mimic the wind in the pines and the crash of the distant surf. And so, the world turns. The great powers of Europe eventually send their own ships across the Atlantic, but they do not find a wilderness waiting for the taking. They find a network of thriving, interconnected peoples. They find ports where Norse-style halls stand beside long houses of bent birch bark, where the smoke of forge and cook fire blend together. They find diplomats who greet them not with primitive awe, but with cautious curiosity, speaking of trade agreements and mutual boundaries. The history that unfolds is one of negotiation, of cultural curiosity, and of a balance of power that forces the old world to approach the new with a measure of respect. There are conflicts, yes, as there are whenever human hearts and ambitions meet, but they are localized, tempered by the sheer scale of the land and the established strength of those who call it home. Tonight, as you lie in the quiet dark, picture this alternate world as a vast, intricate web, glistening with dew in the morning light. Each strand is a trade route, a marriage, a shared story, a borrowed word. It is a tapestry woven not with threads of conquest, but of slow understanding. It is a world where the Atlantic is a highway of gentle currents, carrying seeds and ideas both ways, where the first thing a European might see of the New World is not an untouched shore, but the friendly, welcoming glow of hearth fires from a mixed port village, a beacon against the twilight. This is a history of ripples, not waves. A history where a man chose to build a fence instead of a boat for fleeing, where a shared meal of maple syrup and dried fish built a bridge across a chasm of fear. It is a reminder that the course of human events can turn on the softest of whispers, on a moment of patience, on the simple, courageous act of staying. So let your mind wander those shell-strewn paths. Smell the wood smoke and the balsam fir. Hear the distant song of a lyre mingling with a bone flute, a gentle, improvised harmony for the coming night. Feel the profound peace of a world that took a different, slower path, where the journey was just as important as the destination, and where the dawn always broke on a horizon of possibilities, not of endings. Thank you for dreaming with us tonight. Sleep well. The twilight deepened over Vinland, staining the sky the color of a bruised plum. Asta watched as the drommer glided into the harbor, its sail now furled, its movement a silent ghosting propelled by the last of the evening tide and the dip of long oars. The water, darkening to ink, parted with a soft, sighing ripple. Lanterns were being lit along the wharf, their warm, oily light pooling on the worn planks and catching the gleam of eyes in the faces of those who had come to wait. There was no shouting crowd, only a low hum of murmured recognition, the creak of ropes, and the gentle thud of the hull meeting the pilings. Asta slipped her feet from the water, the night air cool on her skin, and stood. She watched her father, Arnkel, a man whose beard was more silver than red now, direct the tying off with quiet gestures. His eyes found hers over the heads of the dock workers, and he gave a slow, tired smile that reached his eyes. It was a smile that spoke of long horizons seen and the deep comfort of return. The unloading would wait from morning. What emerged from the ship now were the crew, their sea bags slung over shoulders, and a few small, precious items carried by hand. Arnkel stepped onto the wharf, his sea legs making his gait a deliberate roll. He carried a leather satchel, its strap across his chest. He embraced Asta, smelling of salt, cured leather, and the faint, smoky scent of a distant hearth. The wind was stubborn, he said, his voice a low rumble. It wanted to keep us out for another week. But I told it my daughter was waiting, and it relented. She smiled, taking his free arm as they turned up the shelled path toward home. And what did you trade for such diplomacy? A song? An iron nail? A promise of the first batch of Kessa's summer berry wine? He chuckled. The wind has a taste for sweetness, it seems. Their longhouse stood at the edge of the settlement, where the cultivated plots of cabbages and onions gave way to wild raspberry canes and the dark sentinels of the forest. It was one of the older homes, its timber darkened by decades of weather, the golden thatch thick and deep. The clay-daubed walls between the timber frames were inset with panels of finely scraped birch bark, which glowed softly from within when the central hearth was lit. As they approached, the door, a heavy thing of planked oak banded with iron, swung inward, spilling light and the rich, savory smell of stew. Asta's mother, Gudrid, stood silhouetted in the doorway, a woven apron over her tunic. Her greeting was a practical one. "Your boots," she said, her voice warm. "Leave them there. The stew is just off the boil." But her hands reached out, one to touch Arnkel's face, the other to squeeze Asta's shoulder, saying more than words ever could. Inside, the hearth fire was the heart of the home. Its light danced on hanging bunches of drying herbs, on iron cooking implements, on the carved wooden figures on a high shelf. A mix of a stout Thor with his hammer and a more slender, enigmatic spirit figure with the antlers of a stag, a gift from a northern hunter years ago. The air was layered with smells: wood smoke, stewed venison and roots, the earthy scent of the packed dirt floor strewn with sweet rushes, and the faint, always present scent of pine resin from the walls. They ate from wooden bowls, the stew flavored with wild leeks and a pinch of precious salt traded from the south. Arnkel ate with the steady pace of a man finally on solid ground. Between mouthfuls, he began to weave his tale, not as a formal saga recitement, but as a sharing of pieces. The Kainu people of the great river lakes, he began, using the common term for the inland nations. Their copper is softer this season. They say the old pit is yielding different earth, but they have learned a new way of hardening it in the fire with a certain crushed stone. They traded the secret for 3 of our finest whetstones and a roll of that fine wool from Havitavine. He took a sip of ale. I saw it done. It is clever. It makes the metal sing a different note when struck. Gudrid listened, her hands busy with mending a woolen sock. Asta leaned forward, her chin on her hands. This was how the world expanded, not through the shouts of explorers, but through the quiet exchange of a technique, a trick of the hand, and the grassy sea. Asta prompted softly. Arnkel's eyes grew distant, seeing beyond the fire-lit walls. It is true, west and south of the Great Lakes, the forest falls away as if cut by a giant's scythe. The grass grows taller than a man's waist, and it runs. Asta, it runs like a green ocean under the wind, all the way to where the sky eats the land, and in it the thunder beasts. He used the Norse word, the rumdia, but the concept was new, painted from descriptions, not like our cattle, bigger, shaggier, with great curved horns and a hump on their shoulders. They move in herds so vast the land itself seems to be migrating. The people of the grass follow them. They live in houses made of hide, which they pack onto poles and drag behind their horses. Horses. Gudrid looked up, intrigued. A different kind. Smaller, swifter, like the wind-given legs. They say they came from even farther west, long ago. He opened his satchel and drew out a small bundle. Unwrapping the soft leather, he revealed a tuft of coarse, dark brown hair and a small, intricately woven band of dyed leather and porcupine quill. This is from the beast's coat, and this, he said, holding up the band, is from a child of the grass people, a gift for a story about the sea ice of the far north. Asta took the quill work. The pattern was not of loops and knots, but of stark, beautiful geometric shapes, triangles and zigzags in deep red, blue, and yellow, that seemed to suggest the endless horizon and the movement of the herd. It spoke of a different aesthetic, a different dream of the world. She ran her finger over it. feeling the tiny, precise bumps of the quills. Later, as the fire burned down to embers and her parents retired to their curtained alcove, Asta sat by the hearth with a small oil lamp. She took her wooden tablet and a sharp stylus. She did not write of battles or gods. She carefully carved the runes for the new words. Sor Rumidur, grassy horse nomads, and beside them she sketched in clumsy, heartfelt lines the pattern from the band. This was her saga, the saga of things known, of connections made. Outside, the sounds of Vinland at night were a gentle symphony. The distant rhythmic crash of the Atlantic on the rocks beyond the harbor was the constant bass note. Closer, an owl called from the deep woods. From a neighboring longhouse came the faint melodic plucking of a lyre, a tune that was somehow both a Norse lament and something else, with a skipping rhythm that might have been learned from a river song. Somewhere, a dog barked once, then settled. The world was at peace, full and breathing. Generations flowed like the great rivers. The Vinlandi Commonwealth was less a formal state than an understanding, a network of settlements, Kopang trading posts, and allied indigenous nations bound by kinship, mutual interest, and a shared set of laws known as the Vinlandic Accords. These were not decrees from a king, but agreements carved on great standing stones at major crossroads and recited at annual things, gathering of free people. They spoke of fair trade, of boundaries for hunting grounds, of the right to safe passage, and of the duty to offer shelter and news to travelers. When the ships from the south finally came, they did not come as they did in our world. It was not the sharp, urgent profile of a Spanish caravel appearing like a dagger on the horizon in 1492. It was a slower, more tentative approach. In the early 15th century, a Bristol merchant vessel, blown far off its usual course fishing for cod on the Grand Banks, limped into Vinlandby harbor with a cracked mast and desperate, scurvy-weak men. They found not a scattering of primitive huts, but a bustling port. They saw long houses with carved door frames, a stone church with a roof of wooden shingles, for the white Christ had come too, slowly, blending with older beliefs into a tolerant, syncretic faith, and a large thing field where a carved stone pillar stood. They were met by a delegation that included a man named Harold, who spoke a heavily accented but comprehensible Middle English, and a woman named Willow Enwind, a respected elder from the Mi'kmaq Alliance, who observed with calm, appraising eyes. The Bristol men were given food. Their ship was repaired in a proper dry dock, and they were asked polite but firm questions about their origins and intentions. They traded their few remaining iron tools for fresh water, provisions, and a detailed map on vellum, showing the coastlines as far south as a place called Norumbega and west to the Great Lakes. The map was labeled in runic script and another, flowing script they did not recognize. When they returned to Europe, their tales were met with disbelief, then intense curiosity. They spoke of a Norse Indian kingdom, rich in furs, timber, and copper, with towns and laws. Their map was copied and studied. The world, for Europe, suddenly gained a new, complex piece in its Western puzzle. It was not a blank space to be claimed, but an occupied space to be engaged with. Subsequent expeditions, Portuguese, French, later English, came not as conquerors, but as hopeful traders, forced to the negotiation table by the evident strength and organization they encountered. They found established protocols. To trade for beaver pelts in the north, one had to go through Vinlandic intermediaries at Leifsbúðir. To seek the mythical copper of the west, one needed guides and permissions from the Vitavine Council. The Vinlandic people and their allies had something Europe desperately wanted, and they had the power to control its flow. This did not eliminate conflict.
There were clashes with overzealous European captains who tried to seize what was not given, with rival indigenous nations further inland whom the Vinlandic network did not control, with the inevitable misunderstandings born of different worlds. But these were not wars of extermination or wholesale displacement. They were sharp, brutal, but localized affairs, followed by tense renegotiations. The technological edge of Europe was blunted by geography, by the Vinlandic adoption of effective indigenous tactics for forest warfare, and by the simple fact that the newcomers had no foothold, no vulnerable colony to attack. They were visitors on a shore, watched by many eyes. In this world, the great dying, the catastrophic pandemics that swept the Americas in our timeline, was not absent, but its wave was broken. The continuous centuries-long contact across the North Atlantic had meant a slow, tragic, but steady trickle of old world diseases. Populations had been struck, had mourned, and had, over generations, developed resistances. When the full force of European contact arrived, the people of the eastern woodlands and the Vinlandic settlements were not a fragile biological tinderbox. They were survivors. Their numbers were still strong, their social structures intact, their knowledge of the land undiminished. Asta's descendants, 5 generations on, would not live in a longhouse by the forest, but in a tall timber and stone house in a bustling smoky port city still called Vinlandaby, now a nexus of world trade. From its harbors, one could see the high carved prows of Vinlandic knarrs alongside the sleeker caravels of Portugal, the cogs of the Hanseatic League. In the market squares, the air buzzed with a dozen languages. Vendors sold Icelandic dried cod, Venetian glass, wampum belts from the south, and exquisite birch bark boxes from the west, inscribed with both runic proverbs and animal spirits. A young man named Leif, for the old names never died, sits in a scriptorium, not with a wooden tablet, but with a book of fine imported paper. He is writing a history, not in saga poetry, but in clear, descriptive prose. He writes in a language that scholars from Copenhagen would call a fascinating dialect of Old Norse, infused with loanwords and a smoother grammar. He writes about the great negotiation of full-defined when the Vinlanda Commonwealth, the Mi'kmaq Alliance, and the representatives of the French crown signed the Treaty of the Shared Shore, establishing rules for settlement, trade, and mutual defense. It was a document with 3 seals, a fleur-de-lis, a carved turtle, and a Viking longship. Leif looks up from his work, out the window to the harbor. He sees the ships, the mingling of worlds. He hears the sound of a blacksmith, the call of a vendor selling fried dough dusted with maple sugar, the distant chant of monks from the monastery on the hill where the White Christ, Odin, and the Creator Spirit are all given their due in complex, intertwined theologies. It is not a quiet world. It is a busy, sometimes noisy, often contentious one. But it is a world that grew from a choice to build a fence, not a boat for fleeing. It is a world where the first contact was not a prelude to conquest, but to conversation, however hesitant. The rhythm of this world is not the frantic, desperate drumbeat of colonization and resistance that defined our own. It is a slower, deeper, more complex rhythm. The rhythm of the seasonal trade convoy, the rhythm of the annual thing where grievances are aired and laws affirmed, the rhythm of generations intermarrying and creating new traditions. It is the rhythm of a tapestry being woven on a loom so large its pattern can only be glimpsed by gods and historians. A tapestry whose threads are the color of sea wool, forest green, copper red, and grass gold, all intertwined. So, as you drift towards sleep, let the sound of that imagined world be your lullaby, not a song of perfect peace, for no human world is that, but a song of continuity. The gentle lap of water against a hybrid hull, the scratch of a rune carver's stylus next to the painter of quill work, the murmur of a market where 100 words are spoken, the wind in the endless pines, a wind that has carried stories across an ocean for 1,000 years and found them changed, but still singing on a different shore. It is the sound of a path taken, not the one less traveled by, but the one that was built, slowly and together, stone by stone, word by word, across the bridge of a shared maple-sweetened winter. A world that chose to stay and in staying learned how to grow.